Chris, and today I want to go over market failure and the role of government, specifically public goods, and how the government gets involved there. And first, before we look at a government-intervened economy, I want to look at a free market, laissez-faire, open economy. And the way I want to do that is just a two-person economy. We could do a seller who's selling widgets or something like that, like we like to do in Khan Academy, and I'll have our widget down here, and a buyer, and our buyer will be here on the right. And what do we have? What's going on here? So on the left, our seller is selling this widget, and in our free economy, they're allowed to produce whatever they want, produce however much they want, figure out how they want it to be produced, even can determine who they want to sell to and how much they can charge for it. And on the right here, for our buyer, what's happening here? Our buyer is allowed to shop around for different sellers, find the best product, find the cheapest product. They have cash. They can find the highest quality product what they want. And in a perfect situation, our buyer will give our seller some compensation, some cash, and they will get in return the widget. And what's happening here is we're seeing a very basic idea of an optimal supply and demand curve, right? So here's our downward sloping demand and our upward sloping supply with the quantity and the price, and they've met at equilibrium price and they've met at equilibrium quantity. But what we want to ask is if the market ever fails for this, if there's situations where they don't meet at this equilibrium, this optimal equilibrium. And what it turns out is economists have found is the answer to that is yes, there are. And they like to talk about 4 different situations where this is the case. And the first one is the one that we're going to talk about in this video, and that's public goods. And then I'll just list the other ones for you just so you can know them. The second one is externalities. The third one is monopolies, and the fourth one is distribution of wealth. And these can all get a little bit political, which I think they're honestly like the defining factor for the political parties personally. But we want to look at the economic theory behind them. And so the economic theory behind the first public good, and we'll just talk about what a public good is very quickly. It really is just anything that the government provides, any good and service, so like a school or a park or a road or a library or anything like that. And there's really 2 characteristics that are usually talked about. And the first one is this idea of non-exclusion. So this idea that anyone can use it even if unintentionally. And one of the most interesting ones to think about is this idea of national defense. You know, a lot of people don't really think about this on the forefront of their mind, but they're paying the military to protect them, and everyone is using it even if unintentionally. So you think about a foreign attack, the military is going to protect, you know, the plot of land or the state or the country. They're not going to protect individual specific people. You know, everyone is using that good or service. And the second one, which I think is a little bit harder to grasp, is this idea of non-rival, or sometimes called shared consumption. This idea that one person's consumption of a good does not reduce the usefulness of it to others. So for example, let's just say me and you are hanging out at a park over here, and I'm hanging out on the left and you're hanging out on the right. Me being there is not going to reduce your utility, like economists like to call it, the usefulness or the enjoyment of the park. And say a third person comes along and they're hanging out there, your utility will not be diminished. And I guess you could say that there's the argument, you know, there'd be another person, and as soon as a ton of people get there, maybe there starts to be some diminishing utility there. But for the most part, that's not necessarily the case. But what we failed to define in the beginning is, why are there these differences in public and private good? Why do we even have public goods and private goods? And really what it comes down to is this idea that there's little opportunity to earn profit. Oops, spelled opportunity wrong there. Little opportunity to earn profit from public goods. And this comes down to this idea, and really what it stems from is this non-exclusion principle. It causes this thing that economists call the free rider problem. I'll just drag that down there for us. Free rider problem, and you can probably guess what that means. You know, free loading, free rider. And one of the most interesting ones that I've heard of is the lighthouse free rider problem. And I'll just draw a quick lighthouse. Doesn't really look like a lighthouse, but that's okay. There's a light there. And say we have a lighthouse, and say that there is, let's see, some water, and maybe you own a boat or something like that, or a sailboat or something, and you use this lighthouse, and the lighthouse comes up to you and they say, hey, we need you to start paying us. We need to charge you. And you say, okay, that's fine with me. You protect me from these jetties and these rocks over here on the left. But the problem arises is when we have a free rider, when we have this free rider coming along. You can see where this is going. We have another boat that comes along, and, you know, maybe they don't come around enough that the lighthouse gets to, you know, hunt them down and ask them to be paid or whatnot. So this boat is a free rider. They are using a good or service without being charged, without paying for it. And you could see how this problem can arise in streets and lampposts and all that type of stuff. And there's tons of different examples that you can use there. And what's interesting is you see this dynamic in the U.S., the difference between how we switch from what we want public and private goods, what we think should be public and private, and the most recent is the healthcare. But there's even 100 years ago, even the fire department used to be privatized. It wasn't a public good, which is interesting. So I think what we're going to look at here is this idea of the demand for parks, of a public good, and we'll do specifically parks. And on the right here, I have a table, and on the left side of this table is the quantity for each number of park. Each additional unit of park, and on the right side is this S. You can see that it's 5 there. So the S is how much it costs for each additional park. So each park costs the same amount for us in this situation, so it's $5. I'll put my name here on the left, and then I'll put let me get this red. I'll put Sal's name. We'll see how much Sal likes parks, and Sal's name is here. And let's just look at how much I'm willing to pay for one park. And I would say I like parks, so I'm willing to pay $4 for the first park. And then for the second one, for each additional unit, I'm willing to pay $3. And then maybe for the next one, I'm willing to pay $2, and then $1, and then $0. And you can see some diminishing returns happening here. And let's see, with Sal. So Sal likes parks a little bit more. So Sal maybe is willing to pay $5 for the first park, and then $4, and then $3, and then so on, and then $2, and then $1. And what we can actually do is plot these on a graph. So let me just draw a quick supply and demand graph. So I'll have our y-axis and then our x-axis, and then let me get the q, and then we'll get p. And what we want to do is do individual demand curves, and this is what we call the individual benefit curves, how we benefit from the park, right? So I'll draw mine first, and I'll be right here, and this is my downward sloping demand curve, because you see the diminishing returns. And then Sal likes parks a little more, so he has a higher demand curve than I do. Maybe we didn't talk about him, but maybe Jason, one of our friends, somebody like that, hates parks, and he's down here. And then maybe we have a friend who loves parks, and they're up here. And you can see where this is going. There's tons of friends and tons of people in our society, and they all love parks. And what we do is we add this up, and what they call it is called aggregate demand or collective demand. And we can actually add all of these up and figure out the collective demand of society. And I'll put a little D and then a C for collective for us right here. So we have our demand, and now we want to figure out what our supply is. And what is our supply? Our supply is what it costs to produce this, right? And so we already know that. We have that on our table over here. We know that it costs us $5 per park. And what's interesting about this, each park costs the same. So what actually is happening here is we have a horizontal supply curve. So I'll put a little S for us here. And what we want to do is figure out how much it costs us, how many parks the government should be willing to build. And how do we do that? What's the best way to figure that out, right? So we can actually graph this, and we'll see where that best place is. And that best place is actually, probably you guessed it, at this intersection here. And the best way to do this is actually, let's do this by plotting the numbers we have here, right? So for the first number we have here, we look over here for quantity 1. So quantity 1, we have Chris and Sal is the collective demand. So Chris and Sal are willing to pay $9 collectively. So all the way up here, we have our $9 that we're willing to pay. And then our supply is 5, as we've noted. And then our second quantity, I'm willing to pay 3, and Sal's willing to pay 4. So 7, so on our demand curve, we have a 7 here, right? So where we want to figure out where this is, we need to figure out where the marginal, and this is important, where the marginal social benefit, which is our demand, so our social benefit, the collective benefit, is equal to our marginal social cost. And we already know what our marginal social cost is, right? Our marginal social cost is that it costs us $5 each time for us to build a park. So where on our left side here does it equal 5? And I'll point it out for us right here. So when we add 2 plus 3, we have 5 equal together. So now we know our society, our government, should be building 3 parks because the marginal social benefit is equal to each other. and that's this guy right here. So that's how government decides how much public goods it should build.